The 2018 NFL Draft is in the books. Put it in a box, wrap it, put a bow on it, and stick it on the shelf of history. It's done. I'm already looking forward to the 2019 draft. It's like a never-ending cycle here. It's a sickness, a disease, and I want more. But now that the draft is done, we're going to find ourselves as football fans trying to fill the time the next few months. So we got to find things to talk about. And one of those things that we're prone to do during a draft, immediately after a draft, is give our reactions and analysis and grading and talk about winners and losers. And I know there's that thought out there of how can you grade a draft when these players haven't even hit the field? And there's something to be said about that, absolutely. Ultimately, we know what we know and we don't know what we don't know, and we can have our beliefs and preconceived notions, but the truth is we don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does. None of us. And that's part of the fun of it, is making predictions, going on record, coming out with a take or an opinion, and seeing how it holds up through the test of time. You could sit there and look back a few years later and say, well, they should have done this or they should have done that. I feel like it's much more fun to say that up front, and sometimes you're right and validated, and sometimes you get snake bit right in the ass. But again, that is the nature of the beast. It's what we're prone to do. And yes, some of the teams that I might talk about as winners here end up in 3 years, we look back, and their draft sucked. That happens. We could also look back at some of the losers that I call out in this video in 3 years and say, well, it shows what you didn't know. Their drafts actually were pretty good. And that absolutely happens too. A notable example of that was the 2012 Seahawks. What the hell are they taking Bruce Irvin's ass at pick number 15 or whatever the hell it was? He's a mid-20s edge rusher with a bunch of off-the-field questions. Bobby Wagner, a linebacker from Utah State in round 2? You just gave Matt Flynn money, and you're going to take a 5'10 quarterback in Russell Wilson in round 3? That was a draft that helped make the Seahawks Super Bowl champions. So that is how it goes sometimes. But I do feel like you can still evaluate based off of players available and what teams did or didn't do, moves that they made or didn't make, players that they took or didn't take, needs that were filled or not filled. I do feel like you can grade it based off of that. And that's what I try to do here. So, without any further ado, it is time to talk about the winners and losers of the 2018 NFL Draft. So starting off with the winners, and I'm not ranking them in any order like 1 through 5 or 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They're just 5 winners. And I start off with the Baltimore Ravens. This was, I felt, a really good draft for the Ravens in Ozzie Newsome's last draft as the general manager of the organization. When you look at what happened, they started off with pick 16. They were able to peel back to 22 and then to 25, and in my estimation, get the draft's top tight end in Hayden Hurst. So you move back 9 spots and still get your dude. Then are able to come back up at 32 and potentially put the organization in a great position long term by getting, on my board, the second best quarterback in this draft in Lamar Jackson. So you're getting a guy that can help right now in Hayden Hurst. You're getting a guy that could be the long-term face of the franchise in Lamar Jackson, and make sure that you have an action plan in place for the future to replace non-elite Joe Flacco. Then I look at day 2. Orlando Brown to me can be a future starting right tackle in this league. Mark Andrews. There is nothing illegal about having 2 tight ends that can catch the damn football. Andrews can come in and be a nice complimentary Dennis Pitta type of guy to Hayden Hurst's Todd Heap, if you will. Then I look at day 3. Anthony Averett should contribute, the defensive back from Alabama. Looking at how they address the wide receiver position on day 3, it feels like either Jaleel Scott or Jordan Lastly should be able to contribute in some way. And then getting Deshaun Elliott in round 6 to me felt like an absolute steal. Like, he's a football player, a good one. And him going this late in round 6 seemed borderline criminal. So they got help, in my opinion, on all 3 days of the draft, got their potential future franchise quarterback It was a great weekend's worth of work for Ozzie Newsome in his last draft. I go to my Chicago Bears. At pick 8, they got a future star, impact middle linebacker, inside linebacker in Roquan Smith. This pick makes sense on so many different levels. So many different levels. To sit there and get a guy like this and not reach for a need elsewhere. Just take a guy that's going to be a stud. And then going on to round 2, getting James Daniels, the center from Iowa at pick 39, you're helping to further protect Mitchell Trubisky. Now you're allowing Whitehair to potentially flip out to guard. Now you look at that interior of that Bears line with Whitehair and Long flanking Daniels at center at the 2 guard positions. You feel a lot better about this line. And then trading up, making the ballsy move to go get, in my estimation, the second best wide receiver in this draft in Anthony Miller from Memphis at pick 51. I was stunned that it happened. I'm still so excited. I'm beside myself. They give up a second-round pick next year. Who cares? They needed that impact player now, and they got that impact difference maker right here. When you look at the names and the talent and the fits, I feel like just the first 2 days alone, nobody did any better than the Chicago Bears in terms of who they were able to take. And I know a lot of Bears fans kind of feel like the Bears organization jumped the shark a little bit. Ryan Pace kind of fell off the wagon in day 3. But Joel Iggy is a guy that can immediately contribute in sub-packages with his ability to get after the quarterback just a little bit, his ability to play the run, his ability to cover, especially in zone. He's really good in zone. He's got some upside to potentially be the starter next to Roquan Smith in the middle. Bilal Nichols from Delaware. He's at least a rotational guy and potentially a future starter who was playing out of position as a nose at Delaware in 2017. And Kylie Fitz is a guy, had injury issues the last 2 years, but he has athletic upside as an edge rusher, and they got him in round 6. Javon Wims, the wide receiver, he's got some projectable physical talents there, and he was round 7. So when you look at the pretty bona fide guys they got in the first 2 days, I could at least see there was a philosophy in place here. They were going for projectable athletes on day 3, and I can get behind that. The Cincinnati Bengals, I feel like, had a pretty good draft too. They were able to get Cordy Glenn, a really good left tackle in this league, and all they had to do was trade down from 12 to 21. That feels like a price you'd want to pay every single time. Then at 21, they further improved that offensive line by getting Billy Price from Ohio State, who I feel is better than Frank Ragnow, who was the pick that went before to the Detroit Lions. You look at round 2, Jesse Bates has potential as a center fielding free safety, and I thought he was a better prospect than Terrell Edmonds, who went in round 1. You look at round 3, Sam Hubbard, Malik Jefferson. Those felt like really solid round 3 choices. Jefferson bringing some much-needed athleticism to that linebacking core. Sam Hubbard has the potential to be a future starting base end. You look at round 4, Mark Walton becomes Joe Mixon's backup long-term, a guy who could potentially start in a pinch if you needed him to. Then I look at the corners that they took in Harris and Phillips, and they've got some upside. Andrew Brown was a highly recruited guy coming out of high school, never quite put it together in Virginia, but another projectable athlete on day number 3. And Auden Tate, the receiver from Florida State, could be a steal in round 7. I thought when you look at the entirety of the picture, the Bengals had a really good draft weekend. The Green Bay Packers, they got a 2019 first-round pick. The only team right now with 2 first-round picks in 2019 to move down from 14 to 27, they move back up to 18 to still get the guy they may very well have taken at number 14 in Jair Alexander. And in the process, to move down 4 slots, they gave up a 3rd-round pick, but got a 1st-round pick next year. Feels like you got to take that deal every single time. Then in round 2, you follow that up by getting, in my opinion, the best corner in this draft in Joshua Jackson. It feels like with the recent investment of draft picks into that secondary for that Green Bay defense last year, Kevin King and Josh Jones. This year, Jair Alexander, Joshua Jackson. Mike Pettin's going to love those new targets, those new studs that he's got back there. That Green Bay secondary, I feel like, is finally fixed. Oren Burks from Vanderbilt feels like a future starter. He really does. Cole Madison, the offensive lineman, might be too. They addressed wide receiver 3 different times. Jamon Moore, Valdez Scantling, and then getting Equanimous St. Brown in round 6. One of these 3 guys will make it. This was a really good weekend's work for the Goot, the Packers' new general manager. And I'll give credit to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They traded back 5 spots from 7 to 12, and in the process were able to get 2 second-round picks. That's nice work if you can get it. While it was surprising that they took Vita Vea over Derwin James, and that might not have been the path that I went down, it's important to note that Vita Vea is a stud and will instantly provide a massive upgrade in the middle of that Buccaneers defense as a run defender and will make life easier for Gerald McCoy. Ronald Jones was my second-rated running back in this draft. He's a 3-down difference maker. Those second-round picks they were able to use that they got from the Bills on M.J. Stewart and Carlton Davis. Vernon Hargreaves, I hope you're paying attention because these guys are coming for you. These 2 guys can play in the league, and they will vastly help that Buccaneers secondary. And I look at Alex Kappa, Jordan Whitehead, guys that they got a little bit later that feel like, to me, future starters. The way I look at it, the Buccaneers potentially got 6 future starters out of this draft. And you feel like any draft that you go into and you can get 6 future starters, you've got to be considered a pretty big winner, in my opinion. Those were the winners, and now we go to the flip side of things, and it's time to talk about the losers. And look, I understand in a couple of years we can look back. I probably will be right on a couple of these and probably wrong on the other ones. That's just the nature of things. But based off of what I saw over the course of the weekend, these were the teams that I questioned the most. These were the teams that I thought did the worst for themselves. Not necessarily in any particular order, just the teams that I thought could have done better or a lot better. I start off with the Seattle Seahawks. They traded back from 18 to 27, which I don't think was a surprise to anybody that they were going to trade back. But then they still overdrafted Rashard Penny. I like Rashard Penny quite a bit, actually. So don't get it twisted. That said, it feels like picking him at 27 was overdrafting. And the Seahawks, even though I used the example earlier in the video talking about their 2012 draft, they do have a long history of overdrafting guys that they like. And it's part of the reason I feel like they're in the position now where they are trying to do a quasi-rebuild and a full-on reload on the fly to maximize their window of opportunity to try and contend. Because they have massively reached on guys like James Carpenter and Jermaine Ifedi and Malik McDowell, first and second round guys in recent years. They've overdrafted a lot of these guys. They haven't played the draft game nearly as well as they should have. They failed to recoup the second-round pick that they originally traded away for Sheldon Richardson. That does have to be part of the grade here. They gave up a second-round pick for Sheldon Richardson, who is now in Minnesota on a 1-year prove-it deal. He didn't really bring you much. You gave up a second-round pick for him to not give you much and be gone a year later. That was a 1-year rental that backfired. Rasheem Green has some upside, but he also has some risk. Their day 3 was pretty good. I will give them that. And personally, I feel like Penny will be too. And I feel like running back was a really big need for the Seahawks. But it's more to me about philosophical approach and how they handled the first 2 days of the draft that I just didn't particularly like very much. The Pittsburgh Steelers. This is a team that's on the cusp. This is a team that's really close. This is a team that needs something to get them over the edge. And I'm sorry, I don't see how Terrell Edmunds helps get you over the edge. He's not a free safety, which is what you really needed, and he was a massive reach at the end of round 1. I liked his athletic upside, but I didn't think he was, frankly, much of a football player at Virginia Tech. He was more of a guy you gamble on late round 2, early round 3, even though a lot of people, I'm sure, probably had 3rd to 4th round grades on him. I had a 4th round grade on him. The Steelers took him at the end of round 1. And if we're going to say, well, the Steelers are in their position for a reason, yes, but they're also not winning championships right now for a reason, in part because of their absolute failure to effectively evaluate the defensive back position. They have a bad recent history of overdrafting guys and poorly evaluating them, and it feels like it continues here. James Washington, a guy that a lot of people were very, very high on at the beginning of the process. I wasn't as high on him. I'm not surprised that he dropped to the end of round 2 because that felt like more of where he belonged. And while the Steelers do deserve benefit of the doubt when it comes to evaluating the wide receiver position, they absolutely do. You'll wonder how James Washington translates as a vertical threat at the next level without great speed. And then in the late portion of round 3, what is so fundamentally different about Mason Rudolph and Landry Jones, or even Josh Dobbs, that you would have real reason to get excited about Mason Rudolph to where you think he could be the heir apparent? Newsflash, ding dong, dumb dicks, he doesn't have Big Ben's arm talent. He has Landry Jones' arm talent. They just took a younger, cheaper version of Landry Jones. Why did you feel the need to do that at the end of round 3 is beyond me. The Oakland Raiders, while they traded down from 10 to 15 to get him, yes, Colton Miller was still a really big reach at 15. Trade down or not. He had no business being a first-round pick as a player on film. Then in round 2, P.J. Hall was even a bigger reach. That's a day 3 type of guy. He got taken over Nathan Shepard and B.J. Hill. That to me is ridiculous. You traded up for Brandon Parker at the beginning of round 3. That again seemed unnecessary. I wonder how hard Arden Key is really going to fit. I do like some of the things the Raiders did on day 3, granted. But the first 2 days don't look great. I've seen the Raiders have a couple of nice drafts in recent years that I liked. This was not one of them. The New Orleans Saints. You trade a future first rounder with part of the justification perhaps being is that you think you're really close to winning a championship, and you might be right. But you think the guy that is going to get you over the hump is an incredibly raw pass rusher in Marcus Davenport. You give up a future first rounder to move up into the middle of round 1 to get a raw edge rusher. That seems kind of foolish to me. Especially when you factor in legit studs like Tremaine Edmonds and especially Derwin James were still on the board. You passed on those 2 guys for Marcus Davenport. Again, it seems foolish when you look at the rest of the Saints draft. Traquan Smith felt like a big reach. Rick Leonard felt like a massive reach. It feels like the team didn't draft very well throughout, and it really feels like they sacrificed their future in terms of that first round pick in 2019 to not get much immediate help now. And that's questionable to me. Am I forgetting somebody? Oh, you knew I was going to get there. Oh, the skid marks, the Cleveland Browns. Now, let me say this. If it works out, then I'm wrong. And that is fine. And I do not feel like this was a total bust draft for the Browns. I feel like they got several guys that could be very solid players for them and help to really turn this thing around. But here are my concerns with the Browns. Number 1, we start off with pick number 1. All these people that are talking about Josh Allen and how it's hard to project him being able to be successful because you look at quarterbacks that have that low of an accuracy percentage in college, they usually don't get a whole lot better in the NFL. And for Josh Allen to be successful at the NFL makes him an outlier. And how reliably can you trust on him being an outlier? Okay, maybe you're right. But taking Baker Mayfield number 1 overall also takes an equivalent level of balls, because in recent history, how many quarterbacks 6 foot or under have really become big-time NFL starters? You talk about the last quarterback under 6'1" that was drafted number 1 overall was Michael Vick back in 2001. And Michael Vick was also an entirely different type of prospect, an entirely different type of talent, and an entirely different type of player. And even when he was a megastar in the league, it still restricted what the Falcons were going to be able to do because he was extremely limited as a passer. And then you always throw in the Drew Brees comparisons. Let's not forget in that same draft, Drew Brees was a second-round pick with significant concerns about him coming from Joe Taylor's spread system and how it was going to translate with him to the league. Russell Wilson, yes, was a third-round pick. We could say teams missed on him a couple of times. But the fact is, if the Seahawks even had thought that he was going to be that great, they would have taken him in round 1. They wouldn't have run the risk. Sometimes you just get the benefit of hindsight validating your genius when it still points out that you took 2 players before Russell Wilson. But not a long history. We could talk about the exceptions to the rule. We are talking about a 6-foot quarterback with some off-the-field issues and questions. That to me is every bit as much of an outlier as Josh Allen. But we don't talk about it that way, and that surprises me. And ultimately, I feel like the Browns did not take the best quarterback in this draft. So, there's that. Then I look at pick 4. And I understand some of the thought process of long-term. Do you want to pay Bradley Chubb and Myles Garrett, $100 million contracts as edge rushers? Damn it all, that seems like a problem you worry about 3, 4, 5 years down the road when you've potentially got a Lombardi trophy there in Cleveland. You figure that out and you worry about that then. And even based off of what I was hearing Hugh Jackson say on Saturday when he was being interviewed, it sounded like Denzel Ward was drafted for need, not because he was the best player on their board. And if you go back and listen to what he said, that's sure what it sounds like. And when you're in a position when you're picking for need and not the pure talent, that's when you can make mistakes. I do not think Denzel Ward is a bust, but I also in no way, shape, or form believe that Denzel Ward was the best defensive prospect in this draft. Like, you're going to tell me that he was a better defensive prospect than Derwin James? I don't think so. He's a better defensive prospect than both Roquan Smith and Tremaine Edmonds? I don't think so. I don't think he was the best corner in this draft. And he most certainly wasn't a better defensive prospect than Bradley Chubb. And you'd be remiss if he didn't mention the similarities to Gilbert and Manziel in 2014 here, 4 years later. It just happens to be this time the Browns at least finally took the quarterback first. But undersized quarterback with off-the-field questions. Smaller corner with speed. What's so different? Look, I think Baker Mayfield and Denzel Ward are much better as prospects than Manziel and Gilbert. Don't get me started. But I just didn't like where they went. They didn't trade back up into the tail end of round 1 like they had the ability to, like I felt like they should have. Austin Corbett is nice, and he could play center for them. They might be able to play tackle, although I wonder if they view him more as a center. But he wasn't the best offensive lineman on the board at that point. That was Will Hernandez. And to me, you take the best player available and you figure it out later. Don't get me wrong, Nick Chubb was a great pick for them at 35. I love that pick for them. But you also have to look at the bigger picture of that second-round pick cost them $16 million. The right to draft Nick Chubb cost them $16 million because they took on Brock Osweiler's contract last year. So you can talk about all this draft pick currency accumulated, but again, I emphasize, they spent $16 million for the right to draft Nick Chubb. They gave up a third-round pick for a bridge quarterback in Tyrod Taylor. So a third-round pick for a guy that might be with your organization 1 to 2 years as a backup. Doesn't that seem kind of foolish where you could have used that third-round pick on a player at a different position that could have contributed for 5, 7, 8, 10 years, or on a draft pick that could do the same in turn? Antonio Callaway, massive upside and potential, and massive, massive risk. He could end up being a starter for them long-term on the outside at wide receiver. He also could be out of the league by 2019. The team failed to acquire any meaningful future draft pick currency. They didn't get much more in terms of this draft. They didn't set themselves up well for 2019. I just look at the Cleveland Browns, and while I don't think they were total losers here, and like I said, they got some players like Jannard Avery I really liked for them in round 5. I thought Callaway was worth the risk for them at that point at round 4. I think Nick Chubb is going to be their featured back at some point in 2018 or 2019 at the earliest. Austin Corbett is a long-term starter in this league. I feel like Denzel Ward is a long-term starter in this league. I think Baker Mayfield has upside and could be the guy, the perfect guy for the Browns with his attitude and belief in himself, but he's just as likely to bust out as he is to become a star. So this wasn't a totally lost draft. So I don't want you to think I'm just crapping on them for the sake of crapping on them. But I feel like it's also important to look at the entirety of the big picture here and understand that the Browns were in a great position here, and I don't feel like they did nearly as well as they could have. And this whole thing about praising John Dorsey and heaping praise upon John Dorsey, just because the dude's better than what you have had in the past doesn't automatically make him great. All these people are sitting there kissing his ass and sucking up to him when he basically built a wild card team in Kansas City. I could see if you were talking about back in the day, a decade ago, there's this Bill Polian coming off of how he built the Bills and the Panthers and the Colts. Then all benefit of the doubt is reserved for Bill Polian. He would earn it. He would deserve it. If you said it was Ron Wolf, same type of deal. Going back further in the day, if you said it's Jim Finks, same deal. But Dorsey didn't build championship contending teams. He built a wild card team. Just because he is so much better than what you've had, which is complete and total crap, doesn't mean that he's great. And looking at this draft, I have questions about what they did. The Browns are going to be better in 2018, and several of these guys in this draft class are going to contribute. This will not be one of these draft classes I feel like we look back in 3 or 4 years and be like, God, they made mistakes all over the place. That's not the case. But I do feel like they didn't take the best quarterback in this draft. They did not take the best available defensive player in this draft. They didn't accumulate additional draft pick currency that mattered this year, and they didn't position themselves in a position of strength and power next year, which they had the ability to do. So that does make them losers for me. They may no longer be the skid marks, but let's pump the brakes on talking about trust in their process, okay?